When my husband passed away, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "If you can't pitch in for the bills, you'll be out on the street." Desperate, I took a job as a caregiver for a wealthy man confined to a wheelchair. By the second night, I found myself frozen in place. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Follow my story to the end, and comment below with the city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story travels." The envelope felt heavier than it had any right to in my shaking hands. Overdue notices always had that effect, like they carried more than just paper and ink, but the weight of helplessness too. I sat at the same little kitchen table Richard and I had bought 3 decades ago at a yard sale, staring at the bold red letters splashed across the electric bill. "Margaret, we need to talk." I looked up and saw Stephanie leaning in the doorway, her polished nails tapping rhythmically on the frame. My daughter-in-law had a way of turning even the simplest words into something threatening. She'd moved into my home 5 years ago, right after my son David died. Said she couldn't afford the mortgage on her own. At the time, I was too deep in grief to question it. Keeping her around felt like keeping a piece of David close. "Of course, sweetheart," I said quickly, tidying the bills into a neat stack. "Can I get you a cup of coffee?" She didn't answer. Just strolled to the counter and crossed her arms. Stephanie was striking in that sharp-edged way that turned heads, blonde hair always in place, clothes that screamed expensive. David had once looked at her like he'd won the lottery. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," she said, her tone all business. "It's not working anymore." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, "I can't keep footing the bill for this house while you contribute nothing." The words hit me like a slap. "I give what I can," I replied, voice unsteady. "My pension." "Your pension barely covers your personal needs," she cut in, eyes narrowing. "I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, everything, for 5 years. And I've had enough." My face flushed with shame. She wasn't wrong. David's passing had left me hollow in every way. His life insurance barely covered his burial, and my teacher's pension, while reliable, wasn't enough to float a household. "So what are you saying?" I asked quietly. She stepped closer, casting a shadow over me. "I'm saying it's time you start paying your share. Half. That's $1,800 a month, mortgage, insurance, food, everything. $1,800. It may as well have been $1 million. My entire monthly income wasn't even close." "Stephanie, you know I can't afford that." "Maybe we can." "No," she said, final and sharp. "Either figure out how to contribute, or find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. I looked at her, trying to find a trace of the woman who once called me mom, the one who sobbed in my arms at David's funeral, who said we'd get through it together. "You're evicting me from my own home?" I whispered. "This isn't your house anymore, Margaret," she said coldly. "David signed everything over to me. Remember? For tax reasons." She smirked. "I've been more than generous letting you stay. But generosity has limits." My hands trembled as I reached for my coffee, needing something, anything, to ground me. I remembered when David changed the deed, said it was easier that way. I never questioned it. I never imagined I'd live longer than him. "How long do I have?" I asked. 2 weeks, she said. "Either come up with the money or find other arrangements." Then, just before leaving, she turned in the doorway. "And don't bother reaching out to my parents or David's cousins. I already spoke to them. Everyone agrees, it's time you learn to stand on your own." Once she was gone, I sat in that kitchen for hours, just staring at the bills scattered like debris after a storm. At 58, I was too old for entry-level work, too young for senior housing, and too broke for just about everything in between. The next morning, I was sitting across from a young woman named Linda at the county job center. She skimmed my resume with a forced smile. "With your teaching background, maybe we can find some tutoring gigs," she said hesitantly. "But the pay's not great." I need something full-time, I interrupted. Something that pays well. Her smile faded, replaced by concern. At your age, and without recent experience outside of education, your options are limited, she said softly. Then her eyes lit up. There is one possibility. She explained the role: overnight care for an elderly man with limited mobility. The work would be tough, physically and emotionally. But the pay? Enough to meet my needs. Do you think you're up for that kind of job? She asked. I thought about the house, the life I might lose. About relatives who'd already turned their backs. I straightened my shoulders. I'll do it. Yes, I said firmly. I can handle that. The agency sent me to a sprawling estate nestled in the hills outside the city. The place looked like something off the pages of an architecture magazine: sleek lines, glass walls, manicured lawns that looked untouched by time. At the door, a housekeeper named Maria greeted me. Her English was a little rough, but she got the point across. Mr. Richardson, he don't sleep much. You stay overnight. Help if he needs anything. He, how you say, not happy since accident. She led me down wide, echoing hallways lined with modern art and quiet luxury, until we reached a separate wing clearly remodeled for someone with physical limitations. The doorframes were lower, everything more open and wheelchair-friendly. He had big crash, car, Maria said in a hushed voice. 2 years ago. Lost his legs, some memory too. Very lonely man. No family, no friends visit. Just doctors, nurses, staff. We stopped at a thick wooden door. He knows you come tonight. I warn you, he not always nice. Pain makes him angry. The first night went exactly as Maria had warned. Mr. Richardson, Richard, as he corrected me the moment I addressed him too formally, was gruff, sharp-tongued, and clearly hated the idea of needing help. He looked to be in his early 60s, his hair a mix of silver and black, his expression constantly strained by resentment and weariness. But I needed this job. So I bit my tongue, did what was asked, and kept my head down, even when he snapped at me for the smallest thing. Then the second night changed everything. I was organizing his medications when he asked for help moving from his chair to the bed. As I stepped in to assist, he looked directly at me for the first time in full light. And that's when I saw it. My breath caught, and the pill bottles tumbled from my hands, clattering across the floor. My legs buckled. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But I knew that face. Even worn by pain and time. I knew that face. It was him. Richard, my Richard. My husband, who'd died 3 decades ago in a car crash in Germany. The man I had mourned for 30 years was sitting in front of me, alive, and staring back with no sign of recognition. Are you having some sort of medical problem? He asked, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. Should I call someone? I was still on my knees, surrounded by scattered pills, staring at a face I never thought I'd see again outside of dreams. The face I'd kissed goodbye the day he left for that business trip to Munich. The face I'd identified in a morgue photograph too damaged to look human. I'm okay, I managed, voice trembling as I tried to gather the medicine bottles with shaking hands. He watched me carefully, his usual impatience laced with something unfamiliar: concern. You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost. If only you knew, I thought. I fought to stay grounded, to breathe. Because this didn't make sense. Richard Worth, my husband, died in 1992. I'd gotten the call, flown across the ocean to ID the body. Buried him myself at Evergreen Cemetery. But this man had his chin, the bump in his nose from that football injury in high school, the tiny scar through his left brow from when he fell off his bike as a boy. These weren't coincidences. I should probably get Maria, I said, trying to stand. No, he said sharply. Don't wake her up over this. Just help me to bed, and let's forget it. As I helped him settle onto the mattress, I studied him again, careful not to make it obvious. He had changed. Age, trauma, time had left their mark. There were scars, a deep fatigue in his expression that hadn't been there before. But he was still him. "How long have you been paralyzed?" I asked softly. He glanced at me, wary. "What does that matter to you?" "Sorry," I said quickly. "The agency didn't provide many details about your condition." He let out a sigh, his anger deflating into exhaustion. 2 years. Car crash up on the Pacific Coast Highway. Crushed 2 vertebrae, damaged the spine. Doctors say I should have died 2 years ago. That would place the accident in 2022. But Richard had died in 1992. Where had he been in the 30 years in between? "Do you remember what happened?" I asked carefully. "Not much. I was in a coma for 3 weeks. Still got holes in my memory." He narrowed his eyes. "Why are you asking all these questions? You a journalist or something?" "No," I said quickly. "Just trying to be friendly." "Well, don't. I'm not paying you to chat. Do your job." I nodded and busied myself with tidying his bedside table, trying to ignore the whirlpool spinning in my mind. Memory loss. Maybe that explained why he didn't recognize me. But it didn't explain how he was alive. While he dozed restlessly through the night, I sat quietly, examining the room for answers. No family photos, no keepsakes. Nothing personal. Just minimalist decor, expensive art, and books, most of them focused on finance, investments, business. At sunrise, Maria arrived for the day shift. As I gathered my things, she caught my arm. "How was first night?" "Eye-opening," I said carefully. "Maria, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years. Since after accident." "Do you know anything about his past? Family? Friends?" She shook her head, frowning. "No. He never speak of past. Lawyers said he has no family. Very sad man. Always alone. Big law firm in city, they pay us, handle everything. Say he made big money in tech. Very rich." I left that mansion with more questions than answers. I didn't go home. I couldn't face Stephanie's glares and cold silence. Instead, I drove to the public library. Spent the entire morning in front of a computer screen, searching. What I found only deepened the mystery. Articles from the last 15 years described Richard Richardson as a self-made tech investor who built a consultancy empire out of nothing. But before that? Nothing. No history. No record. As if he appeared in his 40s, fully formed. Then I searched for my Richard Worth. And there it was. The obituary. Just as I remembered. Survived by wife Margaret and son David. Service at St. Mary's. Burial at Evergreen Cemetery. I'd stood beside that grave every month for 30 years. But the man I had buried may never have been who I thought he was. But if the man in that wheelchair wasn't Richard Worth, how could he look exactly like him? And if he was Richard, then how had he become Richardson? I found myself driving to Evergreen Cemetery, something I hadn't done in months. The headstone was still there, worn from years of weather but legible. Richard James Worth. 1962 to 1992. Beloved husband and father. I knelt beside the grave, tracing the etched letters with my fingertips. "Richard," I whispered, "if you're still in there somehow, I think I'm losing my mind. But if you're not." That night, I returned to the estate with a quiet resolve. I needed answers, but I had to tread lightly. If this man was Richard, something had happened that he either couldn't recall or couldn't speak about. Pushing too hard could shut him down completely. And I couldn't afford to lose the job, not with Stephanie's deadline closing in. Whether or not he was my husband, this man was the only thing standing between me and financial ruin. "You came back," he said when I entered the room. He was sitting near the window, staring out over the manicured gardens. did you think I wouldn't? Most people don't last long here, he said with a dry smile. Apparently, I'm not great company. I watched his face as he turned back toward the window, the fading light casting long shadows across his features. What do you remember about your life before the accident? I asked. He didn't respond at first. I thought he was ignoring me, until he spoke, voice low and distant. Bits and pieces. Business meetings, contracts, financial jargon. No faces. Nothing personal. The doctors say head trauma can damage personal memory while leaving cognitive functions intact. It's unsettling, he said. Not knowing who I used to be. He paused, then added, sometimes I get glimpses. A woman laughing. The scent of fresh coffee. A song that feels familiar, but I can't place it. Fleeting things. Nothing solid. He motioned toward his wheelchair. Nothing that helps me understand how I ended up here. Whether he was my Richard or not, my heart ached for him. Maybe those memories will come back, little by little. Maybe, he said, or maybe the man I used to be is gone, and this is all that's left. I stepped closer to the window and stood beside his chair. Do you ever feel like something vital is missing? Something you can't name, but you know it's gone? He looked up at me, really looked at me, and for a moment, something shifted in his eyes. A flash of something. Recognition? Sadness? Pain? Every day, he said softly. Every single day, it feels like there's a piece of me that's just missing. Something that would make all of this make sense. Without thinking, I laid my hand gently on his shoulder. I'm sorry, I said. That must be an incredibly lonely feeling. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand reached up and rested over mine, and in that moment, I felt it. That same spark, that same connection I'd felt the first time Richard Worth took my hand, nearly 40 years ago. It is lonely, he admitted. Maybe that's why I'm telling things to a stranger that I've never said to my doctors. But I wasn't a stranger. I was the woman who had once shared his life. Who had grieved his death. Who had loved him enough to keep loving him for 30 years after he was gone. And now, somehow, impossibly, I was standing beside him again. Maybe with a second chance. If only I could find a way to help him remember. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a fragile kind of dream. I fell into a rhythm, arriving each evening as the sky turned orange, always finding him in the study, sometimes reading, more often staring quietly at the gardens. His hostility had faded, replaced by something cooler, more reserved. He still kept his distance, but not entirely. I began bringing small, familiar things with me. Nothing too obvious, just small seeds I hoped might take root in his memory. A thermos of coffee, brewed just how Richard used to like it, dark and strong, with a single splash of cream. Soft classical music from my phone, pieces I remembered him humming under his breath while tinkering in the garage. A crossword puzzle book. My Richard had never gone a day without finishing at least one. You know, he said one night as I placed my phone on the side table and music began to play, you don't have to entertain me. I'm perfectly capable of sitting in silence. I know, I replied, smiling. But I like to have music on while I work, if that's all right with you. The melody drifting through the room was Pachelbel's Canon in D, the song we'd danced to on our wedding day. I watched him closely. His face changed. Not drastically, but something in his expression pulled inward, troubled. I know this, he said slowly. My pulse quickened. It's a beautiful piece, I said. A popular choice for weddings. Weddings. He repeated the word as though tasting it for the first time. I get this odd feeling when I hear it, he murmured. Not a memory exactly, but something close. What kind of feeling? I asked gently, keeping my voice even. Joy. And grief. Like remembering a perfect moment that ended too soon. He turned to look at me, his green eyes searching mine. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, I whispered. As the evenings wore on, I started to share carefully crafted stories from my own life, tales that had once belonged to us, though now I presented them as moments from a distant, unrelated past. I spoke of the little home I'd shared with my first husband, painting a picture of the cozy kitchen with its butter-yellow walls and the herb garden just outside the back door. "He sounds like he was a kind man," Richard said one evening. "Your first husband?" "He was," I nodded. "We were young when we got married, barely 22. But we were happy." I paused to gauge his reaction. He used to say the trick to a lasting marriage was making your partner laugh at least once a day. Richard smiled then, an honest, unguarded smile. The first real one I'd seen from him. "That's actually pretty good advice." "What happened to him?" The truth caught in my throat. "He died in a car crash. It happened in Germany. He was there on a business trip." Richard's entire body seemed to freeze. "Germany?" "Yes. Munich. I was supposed to go with him, but I was pregnant at the time and my doctor advised me not to travel." I watched him closely. I've always wondered what might have happened if I'd insisted on going anyway. His voice was quiet. "Maybe you both would have died in the accident. Or maybe," I said softly, "me being there would have changed something. Maybe we would have left the hotel 5 minutes earlier. Or later. Maybe it never would have happened at all." Richard was staring down at his hands, his brows drawn together in deep thought. "Munich," he muttered. "That city, when you said the name, I felt." "What did you feel?" He looked up at me. His eyes were full of fear. "Panic. Utter panic. Like something awful happened there." He leaned in slightly. "Do you think it's possible to remember things that don't belong to you? Memories from places you've never visited?" I chose my words carefully. "I think trauma can leave imprints on us in strange ways. Maybe you heard a story, or saw something on the news that struck a nerve. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it." He wasn't remembering someone else's experience, he was recalling his own death. Or what should have been his death. Somehow, against all odds, my husband had survived that crash. And lost 3 decades of his life in the process. The breakthrough came during my 3rd week working there. I was helping Richard with his evening medication when I caught myself humming, completely without thinking. A lullaby I used to sing to David when he was little. The same tune Richard used to hum while fixing things around the house. His head jerked up. "What was that song?" "I'm sorry," I said. "Was I humming?" "I didn't notice." "Sing it again. Please." I hesitated, then softly sang the first few lines. Richard's eyes went wide. His hands began to tremble. "I know that song," he said urgently. "Not just the melody, I hear it. A woman's voice. She's..." He pressed his palms to his temples. "She's singing to a child. A baby." My chest tightened. "What else do you remember?" "Hands. Tiny hands on my face. A laugh. A kitchen with yellow walls." He looked at me, desperation in his voice. "These can't be my memories." "Can they?" "I don't have a child." I wanted to tell him everything right then. To pull out the photos in my wallet, David as a baby, a toddler, a teenager. I wanted to explain that my hands were the ones he felt. That the laughter was mine. That the kitchen with yellow walls had been ours. But instead, I said gently, memory can be strange after trauma. Sometimes, bits and pieces from other lives slip in. Stories we've heard, things we've seen, they get scrambled together. He wasn't convinced. "No. These feel real. Like they belong to me. There's emotion attached. Not just memories, love. Deep, overwhelming love." He gripped my arm, eyes pleading. "Margaret, what if I had a family before the accident? A wife. A child. What if they're still out there, thinking I'm gone?" The irony of his words sliced right through me. His family was here. Had always been here. Loving him. Caring for him. Waiting for him to remember. Have you spoken to your attorneys? Maybe they could help you look into it. He shook his head, frustrated. I've tried. They say there's no evidence of any family. No marriage license. No birth certificates. They claim Richard Richardson has always been single. But you think that name might not even be yours. I'm starting to doubt everything, he said. These fragments, they don't match the life everyone says I've lived. All the business success, the isolation, the cold pursuit of money. That's not the man I see in these memories. I stayed longer than usual that night. Sitting by his bed while he wrestled with the pieces of a puzzle only he could solve. Several times, he looked like he was about to speak, but the words would falter before leaving his mouth, hovering just out of reach. Finally, he spoke in a voice steadier than before. There's something else, he said. The woman singing that lullaby. I can almost see her face. Not clearly, but enough to know she was beautiful. Brown hair. Gentle eyes. And I loved her. God, I loved her so much. I had to glance away before the tears in my eyes betrayed me. She sounds like someone very special, I said softly. I keep thinking she'll appear one day. Just walk through a doorway, and suddenly everything will fall into place again. He gave a dry, bitter laugh. Crazy, isn't it? Dreaming about a woman who might not even be real. It's not crazy, I said. Hope never is. The next morning, as I was gathering my things to leave, Richard's voice stopped me. Margaret, hold on. I turned to see him moving toward me in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on me with a look of resolve I hadn't seen before. I want to try something, he said. It might sound strange, but I have to find out. What kind of something? I want you to touch my face. Like the woman in my memory did. My breath caught. Richard. I'm not sure that's appropriate. I'm here as your caregiver, Anne. Please, he interrupted. I know it's odd, but ever since you arrived, I've felt connected to you. Like I should already know who you are. Like you matter. My hands were trembling as I lifted them and gently cupped his face, letting my thumbs trace the familiar ridges of his cheekbones. His eyes fluttered shut. I watched as his breathing changed, slowed. Oh my God, he murmured. It's you. You're the woman from the memories. For one brief second, hope sparked in my chest. But then his eyes opened again, and confusion replaced recognition. But, that can't be, he said slowly. You're my nurse. We just met 3 weeks ago. Unless what? He stared at me, troubled. Unless you're not who you say you are either. The careful wall I'd built around the truth was starting to splinter, and I didn't know if I was ready for what would happen when it came crashing down. I barely slept that day. His words kept echoing in my mind, unless you're not who you say you are, either. He was so close now. Close to the truth I'd kept buried for decades. And I was terrified of what he'd do once he uncovered it. That evening, when I arrived at the estate, I found him in the study, but he wasn't alone. A sharply dressed man sat across from him, a sleek briefcase open on the desk. Margaret, Richard said. This is Mr. Patterson, my lawyer. I've asked him to look into something. Patterson stood and shook my hand with a firm grip meant to assert control. Ms. Worth, he said. Mr. Richardson has a few questions about his past. We're hoping you might be able to shed some light. My stomach nodded. I don't see how I can help. I've only known Mr. Richardson a short time. That's what makes this interesting, Patterson replied, sinking back into his seat. You see, as we've been investigating the memories Mr. Richardson has been recovering, we've made some very unexpected discoveries. Richard's gaze didn't leave my face. Margaret, what's your full name? Margaret. Margaret Worth. And your first husband? I hesitated, my throat dry. Richard. Richard Worth. Patterson pulled a folder from his briefcase. This is where things get complicated, Ms. Worth. We found a record of a Richard Worth who died in Munich in 1992. His wife, Margaret, and their son, David, were listed as next of kin. He paused, then slid something across the desk toward me. But we also came across this. It was a photograph. A driver's license, clearly issued sometime in the mid-1990s. The name read Richardson, but the face staring back at me was unmistakable. A slightly older version of my husband. Where did you find this? I whispered. California DMV, Patterson answered. In 1993, 1 year after Richard Worth's reported death, a man named Richard Richardson applied for a license using what we now know was a forged birth certificate. Richard stared at the photo, a look of horror slowly overtaking his features. That's me. But I have no memory of taking that picture. I don't remember anything from the 90s. My legs gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair. The photo shook in my hands. This isn't possible. Actually, Patterson said calmly, it's very possible. There are many reasons a person might assume a new identity fraud, witness protection, even self-erasure. Sometimes, people disappear on purpose. Why would I do that? Richard asked, voice rising. Why would I fake my own death? Why would I leave my family? Patterson turned to me, his eyes sharp. That's what we're hoping you can explain, Ms. Worth. Because it appears your husband didn't die in that car crash after all. The world around me tilted. After all these weeks of carefully rationing the truth, it was now detonating all at once, too fast, too loud, too real. I need to explain, I said, barely above a whisper. Richard rolled closer in his chair, his expression unblinking. Start from the beginning. This time, tell me everything. I drew in a shaky breath. 30 years ago, you left for a trip to Munich. 3 days later, the State Department contacted me. They told me you died in a car accident. The body was badly burned. I confirmed your identity through dental records and items recovered from the crash. But it wasn't you. Apparently not, he said quietly. I buried someone else. I mourned someone else. I raised our son, alone, believing his father was dead. His face had turned ghostly pale. Our son. David. The boy from my memories. I nodded, tears brimming. He passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. He never knew you were still alive. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard stared at me, his face unreadable. Grief, disbelief, anguish, all fighting for space. You knew, he said at last. The first night you saw me, you recognized me. Yes. And you said nothing. What was I supposed to say, Richard? That you were dead? That I buried you? That the life I thought we shared ended with a phone call and a funeral? I moved on because I had no other choice. Life kept going, and I had to go with it. And then, out of nowhere, you appear, calling yourself by another name, with no memory of me, of David, or the life we built together. Patterson cleared his throat. If I may, there's more. We've reviewed Mr. Richardson's financial records. The business empire, the investment portfolio, it all began with a sizable cash deposit in 1994. As if someone had been given a fresh start, with a considerable sum to do it. Richard pressed his fingers to his temples. None of this makes any sense. If I am Richard Worth, why don't I remember? And why would I have left my family behind? Maybe it wasn't by choice, I said slowly, the possibility forming for the first time. Maybe something happened in Munich. Maybe someone made you disappear. Or maybe, Richard said bitterly, I was a coward who ran away from his responsibilities. No, the word came out sharper than I meant. The man I married would never have abandoned his family. Which means there's more to this than we understand. Something happened to you, something that made you vanish, that took your memories. Patterson scribbled something in his notepad. We'll need to dig deeper. Investigate what happened in Munich, identify the real victim, trace how Mr. Richardson acquired a new identity. I don't want an investigation, Richard interrupted. I want to remember. I want to understand how I could forget the people I loved most. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was something new in his eyes. Not quite recognition, but something close, acceptance. Tell me about our life, he said. All of it. Maybe hearing our story will help bring the memories back. So I did. I told him about how we met in college, about our first kiss beneath the old oak tree behind the library. I told him about our simple wedding, just 12 guests, and the tiny apartment with the perpetually dripping faucet he could never fix. I described the night David was born, how Richard had wept holding him for the first time. I told him how he'd hum that lullaby while making coffee in the mornings, and how he'd always sneak little notes into my lunch bag when I was student teaching. I told him about his dreams, how he wanted to start his own consulting business. And about the trip to Germany that was supposed to be the first step. You and David were everything to me, I said at last. When I lost both of you, I thought I'd never feel whole again. Richard had listened silently, his eyes closed the entire time like he was trying to reach inside his mind and pull those memories free. I can feel it, he said finally. Not the details, not the moments, but the emotion. The love. So much love for you. For David. And guilt, this deep, crushing guilt. Guilt about what? I don't know, he whispered. But I know it's connected to my disappearance. I'm sure of that now. Patterson stood, closing his briefcase. I'll continue looking into the records. In the meantime, the more time you spend together, the more likely it is that something will come back. After he left, the two of us sat quietly for a while. Then Richard spoke. I'm sorry. For what? I asked gently. For leaving. For not being there when you needed me. For missing David's life. His voice cracked. Even if I can't remember why it happened, I know that what I did hurt you. I can feel that much. I knelt beside his wheelchair and took his hands in mine. You're here now. That's what matters. But am I? He asked. Am I really him? Or am I just some man who looks like him, with pieces of someone else's life buried in his mind? I looked at him closely, at the eyes I knew better than my own, at the lines time had drawn on the face I once loved, and still did. You're Richard, I said with conviction. You're my Richard. And I'm going to help you remember what we shared. He squeezed my hands, and for the first time since I found him again, I saw a flicker of hope in his face. Where do we begin? I smiled through the tears gathering in my eyes. We start by going home. The next night, I returned to the estate with a box of photo albums and keepsakes I'd stored away decades ago. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. Richard was alive. My husband was alive. And bit by bit, I was bringing him back to me. What I didn't expect was to walk into his study and find Stephanie already there. She was seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression all sugar and subtle poison, the kind of smile that always made me uneasy. Hello, Margaret, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Richard and I were just having the most enlightening chat. Richard looked at me, his expression cautious and uncertain. He glanced between us, clearly trying to fit pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite match. Margaret, he said carefully. Your daughter-in-law shared some rather troubling things about your marriage, about you and the man I used to be. My stomach turned cold. What kind of things? Stephanie stood with deliberate grace, smoothing out the wrinkles in her skirt. I just thought he should know the truth, she said. About how unhappy you were. How you used to say Richard Worth held you back from what you really wanted. That's a lie, I said sharply. Is it? She tilted her head with mock concern. Margaret, you told me, after David's funeral, that the only reason you married Richard was because you were pregnant. That if David hadn't come along, you would have left long ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had said something like that, but not in the way she meant. Not as an accusation. It was during one of our few raw, honest conversations in the middle of grief so dense I could barely breathe. I'd been drowning in guilt and sorrow, wondering aloud if the foundation of my marriage had ever stood on its own, without our son anchoring us. If our relationship had simply drifted apart over time, rather than being shattered by loss, things might have been different. What I'd said was the scattered reflection of a grieving mother, not a confession of how I truly felt. "You're twisting what I said," I told her. "Am I?" Stephanie replied, feigning innocence. "Because I also remember you telling me how relieved you felt after Richard died. That it liberated you from a marriage that had become stifling." Richard's face turned ghostly pale. "Is that true, Margaret?" "No. Absolutely not." I turned to Stephanie, my voice tight. "Why are you doing this?" But I already knew the answer. She had figured it out, who Richard really was. And it terrified her. As long as I was a grieving widow, living under her roof and dependent on her support, she held the power. But if I reunited with my husband, who was not only alive but incredibly wealthy, that control would vanish. Stephanie stepped beside Richard and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, like she was shielding him. "I'm saying this out of genuine concern, for both of you. Margaret's been through unimaginable trauma, losing her husband and then David. I think seeing you has stirred up emotions she hasn't fully processed." "What are you trying to say?" Richard asked warily. "I'm saying," Stephanie replied softly, "that Margaret wants her late husband back so desperately, she's convinced herself that you're him. But Richard, you can't be expected to live up to the image of a man who's been gone for decades." I watched helplessly as doubt crept into Richard's face, the confusion settling in his eyes like a fog. "Margaret, is that what's happening?" he asked. "Are you trying to make me into someone I'm not?" "No." I stepped toward him. "You are the man I married. You are David's father. Every word I said to you was the truth." Stephanie gave a sorrowful shake of her head. "Margaret, I know you want to believe that. But think rationally. If this man were really your husband, wouldn't he remember something? 30 years of a shared life doesn't just vanish." "He has remembered," I insisted. "He remembered the lullaby, our kitchen, our faces." "Implanted suggestions," Stephanie interrupted smoothly. "You've been feeding him details about Richard Worth, and now his brain, damaged as it is creating false memories to fill the blanks." Richard was massaging his temples, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know what to think anymore." "Believe the facts," Stephanie said calmly. "Everything points to you being Richardson, a businessman with no family ties." Margaret's story isn't grounded in anything concrete. It's just grief, turning into fantasy. My chest tightened. I could feel the panic rising. "Richard, look at me. Really look at me. You said you felt like you knew me. You said touching my face brought something back." "I thought it did," he replied, voice uncertain. "But maybe I just wanted to feel connected. Maybe I made myself believe it." Stephanie smiled, smug and satisfied. "I think it would be best for Margaret to take a break from this situation. Let you recover in peace, without the distraction of imagined memories." "No," I moved closer to him. "I can prove who you are. I have our marriage certificate, photos from our wedding, years of documentation." "Those can be faked," Stephanie said without missing a beat. "Photos can be edited, papers forged. Margaret, you're a bright woman, but grief can drive people to do irrational things." I stared at her, something clicking into place. This wasn't spontaneous. She hadn't just figured it out, she'd planned this. She'd been preparing every angle, waiting for the moment to strike. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice low. "Known what?" she replied, still playing innocent. "How long have you known that Richardson is my husband?" For a split second, her carefully crafted mask slipped, revealing the sharp calculation beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said flatly. The timing is too perfect. You showed up here right after Richard and I began reconnecting, armed with the perfect accusations to shatter our progress. You've been watching me. Haven't you? Following me. Richard looked between us, struggling to grasp the weight of what was unraveling. Someone needs to tell me what's really going on. I steadied myself, then spoke the truth aloud. Stephanie is afraid of losing her grip on me. As long as I'm the penniless widow relying on her generosity, she has control. But if I reclaim my life with you, Richard, everything shifts. That's absurd, Stephanie said, but the saccharine tone had slipped. Her voice had an edge now. I'm trying to protect you both from a dangerous illusion. Or, I shot back, you're trying to protect yourself from losing the house that I paid for, from the lifestyle that's been funded by my pension. Richard's gaze sharpened, turning to her. What is she talking about? Before I could respond, Stephanie cut in, her voice rising slightly. Margaret has been struggling financially since David's death. I've been supporting her, gave her a roof over her head, but she's grown reliant and bitter. This fantasy that you're her deceased husband? It's just her way of escaping a reality she can't handle. That's not true, I said, my voice steady. Stephanie, why don't you tell him about the ultimatum you gave me? Tell him about the $1,800 a month you demanded, or you'd throw me out of my own home. Stephanie's cool exterior faltered. That's not exactly what happened. Isn't it? I pressed. Tell him how you threatened to evict me unless I came up with more money. Tell him how that's the reason I even took this job. Richard turned toward her, his expression shifting. Is that true? Margaret's, confused. Grief does strange things to people. Stop lying, I snapped, more harshly than I intended. Richard, she's been manipulating me for years. When David passed, she inherited everything, and she's been using that leverage to control and humiliate me. The only reason she's even here now is because she knows that if you and I reconcile, her hold over me vanishes. Stephanie's cheeks flushed red. You ungrateful, she caught herself, but not before Richard caught the venom in her voice. I think you should leave, Richard said quietly. Richard, please. You're making a mistake. She's playing you. Get out, he said again, calm but commanding. Now. Stephanie hesitated, then stormed out, the door slamming behind her. The silence that followed was thick with everything unsaid. Richard sat there, wrestling with everything he'd just heard. She wasn't wrong about everything, he said after a long pause. My heart sank. What do you mean? I still don't remember our life together. I don't remember being David's father. All I have are flashes, feelings. No solid memories. And I don't know how to tell if what I feel for you is real, or if I just want it to be. I got up and walked over to the box I'd brought with me. I took out our wedding album and opened it slowly, my fingers trembling. On the first page was a photo of us cutting our wedding cake, laughing mid-joke. Look at this, I said, sitting beside him. Really look. He studied it in silence. And then, something shifted in his eyes. We looked happy, he said softly. We were. So young. So convinced love could fix anything. I flipped to the next page. This was our honeymoon. Remember? It rained the entire time. No. He paused, staring at a photo of us under a shared umbrella, drenched but smiling. Wait, the rain, something about getting stuck in that cabin, playing cards, making grilled cheese over the fireplace. Because the power went out, I finished for him. His eyes widened. Oh my God, I remember that. I burned the first ones, and you laughed so hard you nearly fell over. Tears blurred my vision. You're remembering. You're coming back to me. He reached for my hand, holding it with quiet strength. I'm trying. God, I'm really trying. We spent hours going through the photos, more memories bubbling up, some full, some fragmented. But even in that warmth, I felt unease. Stephanie wouldn't give up that easily. She had too much to lose. And I was right. The next morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. Through the haze of sleep, I saw Richard's name and answered immediately, heart pounding. "Margaret, you need to come now," he said, voice tight with urgency. Stephanie came back. And she brought lawyers. I threw on clothes and drove like my life depended on it. When I arrived, 3 sleek black cars were in the driveway. From inside the study, I heard voices, sharp, argumentative. Maria met me at the door, her face pale. "Miss Margaret, they're saying Mr. Richardson isn't who he claims to be. They brought documents. Official ones. They're trying to take him away." My blood ran cold. I rushed into the study and found Richard surrounded by a team of men in tailored suits. Stephanie stood behind them, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Mrs. Worth," one of the attorneys said as I entered, "perfect timing. We were just informing Mr. Richardson that there are serious concerns about his identity and his mental competence." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Stephanie stepped forward, holding a thick file in her hands. "After our chat yesterday, I decided to dig a little deeper into Mr. Richardson's past. And what I found was enlightening." She opened the folder with deliberate flair. "It appears Mr. Richardson was legally deemed mentally unfit by the state of California after his accident 2 years ago. His finances were to be overseen by a court-appointed conservator." Richard's face drained of color. "That's not true. I've been managing everything myself." "Actually," another man interrupted, "you haven't. These individuals have been unlawfully handling your assets. We represent the court-appointed conservator, and we're here to place you under proper supervision." The room tilted around me like a spinning carousel. "This is absurd. Richard is perfectly capable of making decisions." "Is he?" Stephanie chimed in sweetly. "Because just yesterday, he was unsure of who he even was. Isn't that right, Richard? You told me yourself, you weren't sure if you were really you." Richard looked like a man cornered. "I'm dealing with some memory gaps, that doesn't mean I'm delusional." "A man who believes he's someone who died 30 years ago certainly raises questions," one of the supposed lawyers said. "Mr. Richardson, we have medical documentation indicating you've been living under a false identity, believing yourself to be a deceased individual." "Because I am that man," Richard said, almost pleading. "Margaret, show them the photos. The marriage license." "Forgery," Stephanie said dismissively. "All part of the narrative Margaret's been feeding you. She's been planting false memories, reinforcing a fantasy." I stared at her, and suddenly, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just about discrediting me. Stephanie had planned this meticulously. She intended to have Richard declared incompetent so she could funnel control of his estate through someone she could manipulate, or someone already on her payroll. "This is criminal," I said. "The entire thing. Fraud." "Is it fraud?" Stephanie replied coolly. "Or is it a grieving woman coercing a mentally unstable man into believing he's her long-lost husband?" But while the lawyers kept pressing, I noticed something shift. Richard wasn't backing down. His eyes had sharpened. I saw a familiar fire, the same quiet defiance he'd always shown when someone tried to walk over him. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, voice suddenly resolute. "I want to see the court order. Right now." The lead attorney hesitated. "Mr. Richardson, with your condition." "My condition is not your concern. My memory might be spotty, but I'm no fool." "Produce the documents." As they fumbled with their briefcases, Richard turned to me. "Margaret. Call Patterson. Tell him to get here immediately." "Richard, they might not let me." "They will, because I'm not signing or agreeing to anything until my lawyer reviews every word of what they're claiming." What followed felt like watching a house of cards collapse. Patterson arrived within the hour, took one glance at the so-called court documents, and immediately began making calls. Within another hour, we learned the truth. The so-called guardian had been disbarred 3 years earlier for financial crimes. And the lawyers? They weren't attorneys at all, they were actors. Hired by Stephanie. The entire setup had been a staged abduction. A ploy to get Richard to sign over his wealth under duress, transferring it to accounts Stephanie controlled. You planned all of this, I said as the real authorities placed the imposters in handcuffs. Stephanie stood with her chin raised, still playing innocent as her rights were read aloud. I was trying to protect him from your lies, Margaret, she insisted. Everything I did was for his safety. But Richard and I both knew better. When the last squad car left and silence returned to the estate, we found ourselves back in his study, surrounded by the debris of what should have been a peaceful reunion. I'm sorry, Richard said softly. I should have seen through her. How could you have? You've been battling memory loss. She's had years to build her web of lies. He rolled his chair closer to the couch where I sat. Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. While all that chaos was happening, while they were trying to take me, I remembered something. My breath caught. What did you remember? Not everything, he said, eyes bright with emotion, but enough. I remembered our wedding day. I remembered holding David for the first time. I remembered the morning I left for Germany, and how you begged me not to go because you had a bad feeling. My heart stopped. You remember leaving? I remember landing in Munich. I checked into the hotel, then went to a meeting that turned out to be something entirely different. His expression darkened. There were men there. They told me I'd seen something I shouldn't have. That I had knowledge that could hurt powerful people. What kind of knowledge? Corporate secrets. Money laundering. I accidentally walked into a conversation I was never supposed to hear. He ran a hand through his hair. They gave me two options, vanish forever and take on a new identity, or risk your and David's lives. They said if I ever contacted you, they'd follow through on their threats. The room spun. So, you chose to disappear. I chose to protect you. They faked my death. Set me up with just enough to start over somewhere far away. And they made it clear, if I ever reached out, you and David would pay the price. Tears were already flowing down my face. All these years. I thought you abandoned us. Never. Not for a moment. But they were watching. 4 years. Making sure I stayed buried. It wasn't until the accident, until I lost most of my memory, that they finally stopped. I was no longer a threat. And now that your memories are coming back, I think part of me was afraid. Afraid they'd notice. That they'd come back. That's why I resisted you at first. Why I lashed out. Somewhere deep inside, I was still trying to protect you. I knelt beside his chair and took his hands in mine. What does this mean for us now, Richard? He cupped my face with his hands, tender and sure. It means I'm done hiding. I'm done letting fear keep me from you. We've already lost 30 years. I'm not giving up one more day. He leaned in and kissed me, and it felt like finding home after decades of exile. When we pulled apart, I saw something in his eyes that had been absent for so long. Hope. Will you marry me again? He asked softly. I know it might sound unbelievable, but I want to get it right this time. I want to stand before everyone and vow to love you for however long we still have. I laughed, tears running down my cheeks. Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you again. 6 months later, we found ourselves standing in the same church where we'd said our vows 4 decades ago. The ceremony was intimate, a handful of old friends who were overjoyed to see Richard alive again, a few neighbors who'd known us in the early years, Patterson and his wife. But someone very important was missing. David's absence was a silent ache neither of us could ever fully mend. Still, we found a way to carry his memory forward. Richard had created a foundation in David's name, offering college scholarships to children who had lost parents. It wouldn't bring our son back, but it gave his life meaning beyond our sorrow. As for Stephanie, she was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and attempted abduction. The home that had once belonged to David, our home, was officially back in my name, exactly where Richard believed it should be. That was the first thing he made sure of. Do you, Richard, take Margaret to be your wife? To love, honor, and cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Richard said, his voice clear and unwavering. Now and always. When the minister declared us husband and wife, Richard rose carefully from his wheelchair. It was something he'd been working toward in therapy, a surprise he'd kept secret for months. He stood there, unsteady but resolute, and kissed me just like he had on that day, 40 years before. I love you, Mrs. Richardson Worth, he whispered. I love you too, I said softly. Welcome home. Later that evening, we sat together on the terrace of our new house, a cozy, one-story space that suited Richard's needs, but felt more like ours than the grand estate ever had. I found myself thinking about the long, winding road that had brought us here. Do you ever wonder, I asked, how our lives might have turned out if none of this had happened? If you'd never gone to Germany? If we'd just grown old like everyone else? Richard took my hand, gently tracing my wedding ring, the one I'd never taken off. Sometimes, he said. But then I think about how deeply we value each other now. How grateful we are just to have this time together. Maybe we had to lose each other to really understand what we had. 30 years is a long time to learn that, I said. But we did learn, he replied. And however much time we've got left, we'll make it count. I leaned into him as the sky turned gold and pink with the setting sun. Somewhere in the distance, a woman hummed a lullaby to her child. Richard smiled, eyes warm. I know that song, he murmured. Good, I said. Hold on to that memory. And to all the others. As night fell and stars emerged one by one, I felt something I hadn't in decades, peace. Whatever time we had left, we would cherish it. No more fear. No more regrets. We were finally home. And now, to you who've listened to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you lived through something like this yourself? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're here, I've left 2 more stories on the screen, favorites of the channel, and full of twists you won't see coming. Thank you for watching this far.